Hi, Dr. Woeller for Integrative Medicine Academy. This is the monthly installment of the complimentary webinars provided by Great Plains Laboratory. I appreciate everybody joining me for this presentation. Interesting topic. So if you've heard some of my previous lectures, either in person or on the webinar service, you know I've talked a lot about the organic acid test that Great Plains has, and you may know that I teach a one-day seminar for Great Plains, a one-day intensive on the implementation of the organic acid test into practice. Ton of information that test provides. So what I wanted to do in this lecture was go through a little bit about the oat specific to fungal related problems, so mold exposure basically. But more than that, also correlate some other sections on the oat that can be influenced by mold toxins, mycotoxins specifically. And then we'll kind of expand it from there. I'll show you a couple case histories that are kind of interesting as well. And just a greater way of sort of correlating the information. So whether you're a practitioner, whether you're a person just trying to figure out some of your own health issues, perhaps you're a parent of a special needs child learning how to understand some of these tests, and they can find that starting to use the organic acid test more for yourself, your family, or your practice, as well as incorporating other testing like the mycotox profile that Great Plains has, really helps to uncover a deeper layer of underlying biological stress that can greatly impact health in many, many different ways. Okay, so what is mold? Well, molds are fungi that can be found both in indoor and outdoor environments. So they don't really know exactly how many species of mold exist within the world. I mean, you figure, you know, you go to the Amazon, you go to remote places in the world, who knows, mold growing in the deep recesses of a cave, for example. But the best estimates are the different types of mold species are in the tens, if not hundreds of thousands. And now these things tend to grow best in warm, damp, and humid conditions, but you can get some mold that can grow in very dry conditions. When I was doing my internship in Scottsdale, Arizona, a number of years ago, in the southwest area, people develop something called coccidiomycosis or valley fever. And this, in some people, it can be lethal. A lot of people carry it around. They don't even know they have it, or perhaps they just have a low-grade respiratory issue. In other people, it can be lethal. And I was actually working as an intern in the intensive care unit, and this fella had come in who was doing some gardening in his yard. He was planting some plants or whatever. And about 6 to 7 weeks prior to that, he felt like he was coming down with a respiratory infection. So he went to his doctor and they thought, well, you know, looks like you got kind of a bacterial problem. Let's put you on some antibiotics. So they did that. He kind of felt better for a little bit, but it never went away. Went back and said, well, let's switch you up to another antibiotic. So they put him on something else. And he just continued to get worse, started coughing, started wheezing, having some difficulty breathing, and ended up within, I want to say it was about a 6 to 7 week period of time, went into the hospital, finally went into respiratory failure, went into the intensive care unit, was placed on a ventilator, was scoped by a pulmonologist, scans, blood work, etc. They finally diagnosed him with coccidiomycosis, and he died within 7 weeks of his first symptoms. It hit him that fast, that quick. Now, I mean, I wouldn't say that's the norm, but it goes to show you that some of these molds can be extremely toxic in susceptible individuals. Now, fungi is the biological group of organisms, and yeast actually is a fungi, okay? And candida is a yeast. Well, mold also is in that that biological group of fungi as well. So Aspergillus, Penicillium, Stachybotrys, Fusarium, these are all examples of mold, but they're all fall within the category of fungi. So Candida is a yeast, is a fungi. Aspergillus is a mold, which is a fungi. Okay, so they're all kind of wrapped together. And that's why when you look at the organic acid test, on page 1 of that test, the first section is fungal and yeast markers. Where are molds found? Well, I just mentioned in Arizona and the Southwest areas, you can get mold that can actually be growing in the soil, which is where the coccidiomycosis is. Doesn't have to be a damp environment, although most mold is in damp environments. They could be indoors. People have a lot of plants in the house. They get mold in the soil. You can get mold that grows in water damage. So that could be basements, showers, around hot water heaters, for example. Antique shops tend to be high in mold. Greenhouses, saunas, construction areas that particularly in more humid environments can be a problem for mold. But I actually have been in communication with an individual who developed a severe mold sensitivity and mycotoxin problem from mold exposure in a new home. Turned out that they were having a new home built, and there was some storms that came through, and some of the material got wet that was sitting out. That wet material was then used to build a home. Mold grew. They got toxic. So it doesn't have to be an old home. But it's certainly the odds are you're going to get in older homes more of a problem. Flower shops. So if you're a practitioner and you're assessing somebody for mold toxins or suspecting mold toxins, you want to get a sense of their hobbies, where they work, what kind of environment they work in, because that may be, an indicator. It may be that they're getting mold exposure at work, not inside their home, or it could be that they've got a shop somewhere on their property where they spend a lot of time, and that might be the problem area. Cottages and cabins, so these things that sit out in the woods for years can be a source of mold too. So the routes of exposure are many, right? We know environmental mold is real prevalent. You can get mold through food, so Aspergillus in corn, for example. So that's why farmers sometimes can be susceptible to mold. And then, fruits, cheeses, meats, you can even get mold or, mycotoxin accumulation in dairy. And then there's a bunch of different common indoor molds. Penicillium, very common, as well as Aspergillus. So how do molds adversely affect people? Well, they can hit different organ systems, and not everybody's going to get the same problem from the same mold exposure. Most of us who come in contact with mold are able to handle it just fine. Okay, so we could develop maybe a little itchy eyes or runny nose, or maybe a little bit of cough if we're in kind of a moldy environment, but we leave that environment and our immune system, the rest of our body is able to handle it, and there's no issues. Other people start to develop respiratory problems that could be chronic. And of course, if they have some other underlying respiratory problem, that just increases their odds of having issues. Now, so chronic exposure or re-exposure to different molds will increase your risk of reactivity. Also, the length of time that you're exposed. If you walk into an antique shop, right, that's moldy, your eyes might get itchy, or you might get a scratchy throat, but you leave and you're good. But if you work in the antique shop on a day-to-day basis, well, long-term exposure could be a different story. Also, it depends on dose, how much you get exposed to over how long a period of time. Now, clearly, people who have immune deficiencies, other underlying chronic health problems, whether it's diabetes or cancer or some type of immune deficiency, are going to be at increased odds of mold issues. If you have a respiratory problem, so let's say you have asthma, for example, you're going to have increased risk for respiratory problems related to mold. Aspergillosis is a respiratory condition linked to exposure to Aspergillus mold. Okay, a very common mold in our environment. And there's different levels of Aspergillus infections. People could sometimes just develop regular allergies, or they could get a sinus infection, or they may get a bronchitis type reaction. Okay, again, the length of exposure, how much you're being exposed to, and your underlying susceptibility. In severe cases, people can become quite ill from even just Aspergillus exposure. This is an example of an individual who developed something called an aspergilloma. This was what they call a fungal ball that accumulates in the lungs and then over time obliterates the lung, leading to severe respiratory problems and in some cases respiratory failure. I've used this slide in some of my talks related to oxalate, because oxalate, an organic chemical that can cause crystals in the body, can create oxalate crystals that can lodge in the lung if you actually had mold in the lung, which is what's happening in this particular case. If we look at this, A, B, and C is the CT scan that was done 9 months prior to hospital admission. If we look at the right lung, let me get my little drawing tool here. Where is it? Try to grab my pen. Here it is. That's not letting me. There it is. So we can see in the right lung is, at least part of it is starting to fill up. Okay. 3 weeks before admission, that right lung is becoming a little bit more obliterated. The space within the lung for air, the flow of air is becoming more compromised. And then upon admission, that right lung is completely blocked. So this person is developing a massive calcium oxalate crystal or crystals in the lung because of the growth of Aspergillus mold in the lungs. So one of the markers on the organic acid test that might indicate mold exposure is a high oxalate. Penicillium mold is something that's commonly found on citrus fruit. If you ever let like an orange or a grapefruit sit around too long and you start to see this blue-green kind of mold accumulate, that's Penicillium most likely. And there's many different types of species of Penicillium mold, but it can also be found indoors. It is, like Aspergillus, responsible for many of the allergic reactions that people get from these environmental molds. So again, it's not just Aspergillus, Penicillium might play a role as well. But you can get Penicillium because of mold damage too. So building materials, carpet, fiberglass insulation, wallpaper, they've even found Penicillium mold inside furniture. Okra toxin is the most common mycotoxin produced by Penicillium. Okra toxin is toxic to the kidneys. That means nephrotoxic. It's also carcinogenic as well. So let's talk about mycotoxins. What are mycotoxins? Well, myco comes from the word fungi or fungal origin. And these are chemicals that are produced by molds that have or can have toxic results. Okay, and so there could be hundreds of different fungi that produce different toxic compounds. Now, bacterial toxins will usually be recognized by the immune system, but many of these mycotoxins don't have proteins, so they're usually not picked up by the immune system. And that's a real problem because we can't really fight them off immunologically, unfortunately. And they get into the body and they can stay in the body for years, even when the mold source has been removed. So that's why it's important when you're looking at an organic acid test, there's some markers I'm going to show you that relate to mold exposure, but that doesn't mean if the test is negative for mold on the oat that you couldn't have mycotoxins circulating in the bloodstream. Mycotoxins disrupt the cells, they interfere with protein synthesis, they can damage the DNA, they can also directly damage mitochondria. At the same time, they can deplete glutathione. You deplete glutathione, you increase your odds for mitochondrial damage. Okay, headaches, immune suppression, abdominal pain. Sometimes people have chronic GI problems related to mold. Neurological issues, sleep problems, mental health issues, and this is just a short list of things that can be linked to mycotoxin exposure. Now, Great Plains has something called the GPL mycotox test. This is an old slide. You know, it says a brand new urine test. Well, how about we just say new, okay? Because it's been out a little while. It's not like it just came out a couple weeks ago. Extremely useful. And I'm running this in my practice now, a lot more. And it's amazing how many people are walking around with mold, or excuse me, mycotoxins that they didn't even know they had. It's at this point, they'll probably add more chemicals as time goes on. It's looking at 7 major mycotoxins linked to 4 different molds: Aspergillus, Penicillium, Stachybotrys, Fusarium. Okay, I've already gone through Aspergillus and Penicillium. Fusarium is a fairly common environmental mold too, can come from indoor water damage. The Stachybotrys, though, that's a real concern if you're being exposed to that, because this is that greenish black mold. It tends to grow on this high cellulose, low nitrogen material, so really is robust within water damaged homes. So they've even found Stachybotrys in dust, in lint. But it's going to have a tendency to grow around where there's water leaks, where there's been active flooding, high humidity, and condensation. But it does tend to require a lot of moisture. Okay, so constant moisture. Where we live, the house that we live in, this is currently a rental home, and there's an ADU. There's an independent dwelling unit on the other side of the house that somebody lives in. And one day I walk out into our garage, and I notice water all over our garage floor. And I look up towards the ceiling, and a big, huge chunk of the ceiling had fallen in. It must have fallen in over the night because we didn't hear it. And so there's particle board and stuff all over, not particle board, but drywall all over the floor of this water. So what ended up happening is they came out, and there was a little bit of mold growing in there. It was not Stachybotrys, but there was a small little water leak in a pipe that was leading from the bathtub in this apartment's bathroom. The fellow who lives there didn't even know it. He would shower periodically. He wouldn't really take baths, but it was a little leak. And they figured that little leak had just been dripping water, probably for months, and filling up the space underneath the bathtub to the point where it just broke free. Now, again, there was a high risk for Stachybotrys in that kind of environment because of the constant source of water. Fortunately, that wasn't the issue for us, but that's not always the case for other people. So if you find these mycotoxins on the mycotox test that are related to Stachybotrys, it's incredibly important that people have somebody evaluate their home specifically. Now, many of the mycotoxins that come from Stachybotrys are called trichothecenes. And trichothecenes are extremely toxic. One of the things they could do is they could damage the cell's ability to process proteins. That causes cellular disruption. They can also increase problems with regards to oxidative stress, which leads to tissue damage, which leads to inflammation. Whenever you get inflammation, you usually are starting to get immune stimulation. Tricoathecines have been linked to immune suppression, autoimmune problems, you name it. So they're toxic to the liver, they're toxic to the kidneys. Many of them are carcinogenic as well. Also, one of the things that happens with some of these molds, like aflatoxin, which gets produced by Aspergillus, is they can interfere with the liver's ability to detoxify. The cytochrome P450 system in the liver is very important with regards to the processing of different types of internally produced compounds, but also things that we come in contact with environmentally, including chemical exposure. And what ends up happening is what I'm trying to highlight on this slide is if you have aflatoxin that's interfering with cytochrome P450, it can start to also interfere with glutathione production in the liver. And we need glutathione in the liver because it's what helps us detoxify. It'll protect the liver against oxidative stress. Glutathione also is one of the main protecting antioxidants for the mitochondria. The mitochondria being these energy factories within our cells. So there's a lot of things that can impact mitochondrial function. And I've talked about this before through webinars. When I do my organic acid test seminars for Great Plains, we go into mitochondria. Through some of my online courses through Integrative Medicine Academy, I'm always incorporating information about mitochondria, whether we're talking about Clostridia, Candida, heavy metals, toxic chemicals, oxalates. We're currently doing a SIBO course right now, and sometimes people with small intestinal bacterial overgrowth have problems with mitochondrial issues. Mycotoxins can also damage the mitochondria. So let's talk about just a little bit about what are mitochondria and what are some basic functions. Well, again, mitochondria are these organelles within our cells, and they have multiple membranes that are involved in their overall function. They produce the bulk of what's called adenosine triphosphate, the ATP chemicals, the energy currency that our body uses. And that means our brain, our nervous system, our immune system, our endocrine system, our musculoskeletal system, our digestive system is dependent on an adequate supply of ATP. And these mitochondria can be concentrated in different areas of the body. So you sometimes can have a different concentration in, let's say, cardiac muscle of the heart versus skeletal muscle, or the liver versus the kidneys. But one thing's clear is that mitochondria are very metabolically active. They're also very vulnerable to oxidative stress. And one of the main things that protects the mitochondria is glutathione. Now, there's different layers of mitochondrial function. Within the middle of the mitochondria, in what's called the matrix, is this citric acid cycle, also known as the Krebs cycle. And, you know, graphically, it looks like a wheel. As things enter in the top, they get spun, you know, through the wheel, and you get a spill-off effect of different chemicals that are produced. And along the way, we're starting to produce different energy substrates. And we know that mitochondria within the citric acid cycle can be interfered because of heavy metals, because of chemicals, because of candida, because of Clostridia bacteria, or even nutrient deficiency. If we take a look, here is our citric acid cycle. Okay, so this is sitting within the matrix, the middle of the mitochondria. We have two membranes, the outer membrane and then the inner membrane. There's a lot of activity going on within the inner membrane of the mitochondria. In fact, that's the bulk of where our ATP is produced, along that inner mitochondrial membrane. This is an area called the electron transport chain. It's also called the respiratory chain, or a process called oxidative phosphorylation. Those are three words that are commonly used for this particular part of the mitochondria. So things get spun through the citric acid cycle, and then they're in part taken up to the electron transport chain, okay, where again we produce the bulk of our ATP. You can have damage within the Krebs cycle. You can have damage within the electron transport chain. You could even have damage to the cell along the outer mitochondrial membrane. All of that can affect the production of ATP. Now, what's interesting is that we actually need ATP produced by our cells, mitochondria, in order to produce glutathione. So you can see where mitochondrial damage could impact the ability to have enough ATP to make enough glutathione, but if we don't have enough glutathione, our mitochondria are now vulnerable to oxidative stress, and so they get damaged, so they can't make ATP, and we're caught in this vicious cycle. Come back to the liver. Okay, our body, our liver will take these lipid-soluble compounds. This could also, I could use the same information and plug it into a talk on chemical toxicity. So our liver will take these lipid-soluble compounds, and by the way, you can get mycotoxins that get stored in our fat tissues, and our liver, through phase 1 detoxification, which primarily involves the cytochrome P450 enzymes, and in part glutathione, okay? And it starts to convert these lipid-soluble compounds and eventually moves them over through phase 2 detoxification to make them more widely removed from the body, whether that's dumping it through the urine and the kidneys or excreting it out through the bile. So if we've got mycotoxins that are causing a P50 system problem, we're going to already compromise our ability to detoxify in the first phase of liver function. What happens if you have poor phase 1 detox? You've got glutathione, and then you're being exposed to a bunch of chemical toxins. Okay, it's just going to increase your risk of chemical toxicity now too. So, even a worse scenario is having a bunch of mycotoxins as well as chemical toxins that you're being exposed to. And it turns out that the process of glutathione function within the liver is to also make these mycotoxins, specifically in this example, the aflatoxin, which gets produced by Aspergillus. It converts it into a water-soluble compound for easier excretion. I'm getting a message that the sound is a little strange. I really can't do anything about the connection. It's a GoToWebinar thing, so I'm just going to continue. Let's go through the organic acid test. A few examples. So the organic acids test is, a critical test to learn how to use. Okay, and so I've got a ton of material that I've created over the years on the organic acids test. Here's a few OAT examples. Okay, OAT section examples. This is not all the sections, but this kind of relates to this talk. So we've got the yeast fungal markers. You can look at candida and mold toxicity. We've got an oxalate metabolite. I've already kind of shown where that fits in, right? With regards to, we know that mold like Aspergillus and Penicillium can produce oxalate. We've got the glycolytic and mitochondrial markers. And then we've got the indicators of detoxification looking at glutathione status. So on page 1 of the oat, this is an example, markers 2, 4, and 5 are linked to Aspergillus and like other fungal species, could be Penicillium too, okay? Now, when they're showing up in the organic acid test, like you're seeing here, it's indicative of colonization of mold in the gut. That means you're growing mold in the digestive system. The one that I most commonly see on the organic test is marker number 2 when mold is present. Okay, the 5-hydroxymethyl-2-fluoroic is one of the names for this chemical. The other one that you'll commonly see is number 4, the furan 2,5-D-carboxylic acid. Both of these can come from Aspergillus and Penicillium. I don't commonly see marker number 5 all that much, okay, but 2, 4, and 5 are definitely specific to mold exposure. So what you'll see in this particular person is we've got, this is actually a special needs child, we've got 5-hydroxymethyl-2-fluoroic, okay, marker 2, very high. Number 4, extremely high. And when we do the mycotox profile, we've got Okra toxin that's elevated, and there's also an elevation of this other mycotoxin. This one's usually abbreviated Zen. And so we've got some mold exposure going on here. But you also know, we've got mycotoxin exposure. You also know that there's mold growing in the digestive system. And that's because of the presence of 2 and 4. Succinic is a chemical on the organic acid test. It's found on page 2 under the indicators of, the mitochondrial markers under the Krebs cycle section. That's a very strong indicator of mitochondrial dysfunction. Any elevation is significant. Now, it's interesting because succinic takes us back to the slides on mitochondrial function. Succinic, or succinate, is part of the Krebs cycle, also called citric acid cycle. But succinic also lives within the electron transport chain. Okay, so you'll find it within the Krebs cycle. You'll also find it within the electron transport chain. So it's actually found in both places. So it's a strong indicator of mitochondrial problems. It doesn't tell you where the damage is occurring. It's just telling you it's occurring, there's a damaging effect occurring within the mitochondria, but you don't know necessarily if it's strictly citric acid cycle or, let's say, electron transport chains, probably happening on both areas. Succinic is commonly linked to chemical exposure. It's also elevated in the presence of heavy metals. I've had a few cases in my practice where it seemed to be strongly linked to the presence of Clostridia bacteria too. So we can't say it's just one thing, but chemicals as a group really seem to affect mitochondrial function. You could probably throw heavy metals into that category as well. That's why the GPL tox test for chemicals is important as well. If you really want to get a really comprehensive picture of what's going on with your health, your child's health, or if you're a practitioner, your patient's health, is you need to do more testing other than just the oat. The oat is certainly important. I look at the organic acid test as the hub of the wheel, but it's a gateway, okay? It can identify certain problems that are actionable now, but it's also a gateway to potentially other problems. But it's not going to detect everything. And so we have to also incorporate other testing too. It turns out that mycotoxins, for example here, Aflatoxin, which can come from Aspergillus, can also cause an elevation of succinic. Okay, so on this particular slide, what we're seeing is markers 2 and 4. So this is 2, this is 4 on the organic acid test linked to mold exposure. We know that if these are high, it's indicating on the oat, it's indicating some colonization of mold in the gut. It turns out that there's some other chemicals on this test that mycotoxins can cause to be elevated. Okay, so lactic acid being high seems to have a strong correlation to mycotoxins. Glutathione deficiency, that's not strictly related to mycotoxins. Heavy metals can cause it, chemicals can cause it, high oxalate, high candida, high clostridia, nutritional deficiencies like, other stressors. But it's very common to see elevated pyroglutamic, which is linked to glutathione deficiency, as well as seeing lactic acid when mycotoxins are present. So here's an example, right? So we've got an organic acid test, and the lactic is elevated. We also have an elevation of pyroglutamic. Now, for those of you not real familiar with the organic acid test just yet, on the organic acid test, there's a few markers that have these asterisks next to them. And what that means is that have the asterisks are indirect markers, meaning that when there is an elevation of that chemical like pyroglutamic, it means that there's a deficiency, in this particular case, of glutathione. So high pyroglutamic equals low glutathione. The 2-hydroxybutyric that you see elevated is actually linked to the pathway that supports production of glutathione. I should draw that this way. So 2-hydroxybutyric is part of the pathway that leads to the production of glutathione. Sometimes what you'll see is normal levels of pyroglutamic, but elevated 2-hydroxybutyric. In this particular case, we're getting elevated pyroglutamic. The 2-hydroxybutyric is low. So, you're catching this particular test as a snapshot in time. What eventually will happen, if nothing is done in this particular case, is the pyroglutamic level will get higher, and eventually the 2-hydroxybutyric marker will also become elevated because the biochemical pathway can no longer keep up. Okay, it just starts to wear out. The system becomes overwhelmed. Let me go through a case here of this was actually taken in part. It's a little bit modified from the case that I used in the toxicity mastery course that we're currently doing. But this was a 59-year-old female. It's got history of obese, type 2 diabetes, got some thyroid issues. She's hypertensive, taken some insulin, blood pressure medication. Has had some issues in the past with skin fungus and etc. But wanted to do some functional medicine assessment to get a sense of underlying health issues. Clearly, there needs to be some work done on weight and diabetes, etc. But let's see what else maybe going on here. So this was the mycotox profile on this person. We can see aflatoxin M1 is high, so that's Aspergillus exposure. Okra toxin A is high, commonly coming from Penicillium mold. Okay, could be food, could be environmental. This other particular mycotoxin is likely environmental. So one of the things to do in this particular case is to talk about potential food sources, but also to say, listen, it's probably a good idea to have your home analyzed as well. Then things really get interesting, okay? Ryoridin E, verrucorin A, these are trichothecene toxins. They in part could be related to Botrys. You can also, there's another mold called Fusarium, which has been linked to these as well. This increases the potential of environmental exposure. This, I think, increases the odds that there's likely some type of water damage going on, not just a total, not food related. It's not like these mycotoxins are all coming because she ate some moldy cheese. She really needs to have her home evaluated. Now, it's not uncommon to see aflatoxin and ochratoxin commonly together. Aflatoxin being produced by Aspergillus, ochratoxin coming from Aspergillus and Penicillium mold. In those particular circumstances, those two things alone could indicate water damage somewhere in the home, at work, wherever she frequents quite a bit. But those two things could also be related to food. Other mycotoxins are more likely, really more likely, strongly linked to some kind of mold, water damage somewhere in the home facility. Rhyodin E and verrucorin A, again, are trichothecines that can be produced by Stachybotrys as well as Fusarium. They're carcinogenic, they're toxic to the liver, they're toxic to the immune system. One other thing I wanted to point out, I'm just going to show a couple slides here at the end of this lecture. Ochratoxin A, for example, will significantly increase the risk for invasive candida and clostridia. Or I guess I shouldn't say the risk, I should say increase the opportunities for invasive candida and clostridia bacteria. I'll mention that towards the end. But the reality is probably any of these mycotoxins could do that. So here was this individual's organic acid test. Now I've kind of abbreviated, I'm not going through every stage on this particular case like I do in the actual course, but I wanted to point something out. I wanted to see if you can see something here that doesn't seem quite right. If we look at page 1 of the organic acid test, C elevated is arabinose, it's mildly high, and the citramonic. Remember I mentioned 2, 4, and 5 are commonly linked to mold exposure. So why aren't they elevated? This person's got high aflatoxin, ochratoxin, other trichothecene mycotoxins. Clearly there's mold exposure, but why isn't it not showing up in the oat? Well, for the pure reason that there's exposure happening, she's just not colonizing mold in the gut. So this also increases the potential that this is environmental mold, not just purely food-derived mold. You can still have food-derived mold and swallow the mold, but it doesn't grow in the gut. So this goes to show you that the organic acid test is an extremely useful test to learn how to use. And if you find 2, 4, or 5 elevated, the person definitely has a digestive mold problem. But you better start doing the mycotoxin test too, because clearly you can have mycotoxin exposure and damaging effects from mycotoxin without 2, 4, or 5 being elevated. Now, on the bottom of page 2, there's some dysbiosis. There's a little bit of bacterial imbalance going on here. I talk a lot about Clostridia bacteria in my courses. Doesn't appear to be an issue in this individual. Page 2, we've got high oxalates, or excuse me, oxalic or oxalate. That could be food. That could also be in part produced by mold. Now, we don't have mold, from what we can tell now, growing in the gut. You could have mold exposure that elsewhere that you could be producing oxalates. It may very well be that she's just eating a high oxalate diet too. I mean, that's always a possibility. So I'm not going to blame it all on mold. Notice the lactic acid is high. Okay, we've already talked before about the fact that high lactic could be related to mycotoxins. It's clearly been shown in one of the slides I showed previously linked to aflatoxin. Now, if you exercise a lot, you may have elevated lactic acid. If you're under a lot of physical stress or gotten over some recent illness, that too could also cause lactic. So I'm not going to say that lactic is entirely related to mycotoxins. Some of these other markers here definitely indicate mitochondrial dysfunction though. Okay, so there's clearly a dysfunction happening within the mitochondria. And it's not likely just one thing, it's likely multiple things. This is somebody who's obese, they're type 2 diabetic, they're on hypertensive medication. Okay, so it's not like there's perfect health happening for this person and then they're getting exposed to mold. Notice the indicators of detox. Our pyroglutamic is high, that indicates glutathione deficiency, and the 2-hydroxybutyric is high, meaning the pathway that's supporting glutathione production is totally stressed. Okay, so she's way behind in her ability to maintain glutathione levels. Is it all mold? Probably not. Again, obesity, hypertension, diabetes, those things can contribute too. But from I'm going to go back, from where would you go from here kind of standpoint, this is somebody that, you know, you would want, I mean, obviously you're going to want to address diet, exercise, things that you would typically do for somebody who is overweight, somebody who's hypertensive, you know, et cetera, et cetera. It's going to be important to address yeast. It's going to be important to address mitochondrial problems. It's going to be important to also address the mold exposure. And that's probably what this talk is all about, is to say, listen, there's some kind of environmental exposure happening here. You're not going to get rid of these mycotoxins if you're constantly getting exposed within your home or at your place of work. So that's an important component. It's not just about giving an antifungal medication or using some kind of binding agent or giving glutathione supplement and expecting that to cover everything if he's still getting exposed to the source. They got to do some investigative work on the source and try to figure out where that's coming from too. Last couple slides, and this goes back to the discussion with regards to okra toxin. Okra toxin, and again, likely other mycotoxins too, but okra toxin seems to have an effect at increasing the opportunities for invasive candida and Clostridium. This is a paper talking about the effects of mycotoxins on mucosal microbial infections. Okay, that basically means infections along the mucous membranes of the body. That's your sinuses, that's your nasal cavity, that's your lungs, your bronchi, that's your gut, that's your bladder. Because these mycotoxins also have a suppressive effect on secretory IgA, which is the main immune chemical that lines the surface lining or our mucosal linings of our body. And our digestive system, in a significant amount, we produce a ton of secretory IgA on a daily basis. So if you deplete secretory IgA, you're losing some of the mucosal immune barrier, and you're at an increased risk for opportunistic infections. So this is an organic acid test on an individual. Notice that we've got very high level of marker 2 and marker 4. What does that mean? This person's being exposed to mold. You know that 2 and 4 can come from Aspergillus and Penicillium. Because they're elevated on the oat, you know that there's some kind of colonization happening in the gut. There's some growth of these molds in the digestive system. It doesn't tell you how much or how many organisms or exactly where they are. You just know that it's happening. Very good chance too that there's going to be high mycotoxins when you do that test. Notice also we've got extremely high levels of arabinose, which is linked to candida. Okay. Tartaric is a chemical that often is associated with invasive candida as well. I haven't talked anything about tricarboxylic. Tricarboxylic is a chemical that's often comes from a fungus that contaminates corn and corn products. Well, this person has that too. So clearly there's a fungal problem. Notice our Clostridium marker is elevated. Okay, the most common Clostridium marker to see on the organic acid test is HPA. About 1 in 4 organic acid tests that are done and that I've seen in my practice, and Great Plains will correlate this too. The percentages may not be exact, approximately 1 in 4, 1 in 5, will have a positive Clostridium marker, the most common one being HPHPA. Okay. The past information we just presented, or that past particular paper, showed that mycotoxins can have a damaging effect on the mucosal membranes of the body, increasing the chances for opportunistic infections. Well, based on the organic acid test, you're not going to get a more higher level opportunistic organism or organisms than Candida and Clostridia. And this is exactly what they've seen. Okay, those who have positive mycotoxins generally have been shown to have a higher level of invasive Candida markers on the oat, as well as Clostridia bacterial markers on the oat. So again, it's how to organize and synchronize this information and line things up. So to me, the organic acid test is the hub of the wheel, but you got to also fill in the gaps with mycotoxin test, chemical testing, etc. Okay, so that's the information here for this particular presentation. We actually have a website called Lab Tests Plus, where people have access to some of the testing from Great Plains and some other labs, including the organic acid, including tox profile, including other labs that Great Plains carries. And when you order through this website, what ends up happening is when we receive the lab results, there's a written review that's generated based on the relevant markers. I sit down and do a written review on these tests and then provide what are called action step suggestions that can be implemented, shared with other health practitioners, correlated with regards to your own particular condition. So more information about testing through Lab Test Plus, you can go to labtestplus.com. We also have a number of different mastery courses through what's called Integrative Medicine Academy, the course that specifically discusses mycotoxins, chemical toxins, heavy metal toxins, glyphosate toxicity, the incorporation of the GPL tox test, the glyphosate test, different heavy metal tests, different detoxification therapies from chelation to sauna to ion cleanse to glutathione and other supplements. We have 2 modules in this particular course that are specifically dedicated to mold and mycotoxin exposure as well. So that course can be accessed at any time. There's continuing education credits available, there's course exams, there's extended access to course material. All of our mastery courses, including Toxicity Mastery course, has a forum that you can post questions to that we answer on an ongoing basis. Okay, so if you want more information about Toxicity Mastery, you can go to toxicitymasterycourse.com, or you can email to toxicitymasterycourse@gmail.com. Also, there is this special report book that you can obtain. It's a complimentary book. All you got to do is text the word toxicity to 66866. This has some interesting information about it, about chemical toxins, mold toxins, etc. So you can text the word toxicity to 66866. If you are a parent or a caregiver of a loved one with autism and you have questions about mold or the mycotox test or the organic acid test or whatever, we have a website called Autism Recovery System. This is a subscription website. within the website, there is a ton of accessible material. There's videos, there's case reviews, there's protocols. There's a forum within this site where people post questions to me on a daily basis, and I'm interacting with people really all over the world who are using this particular site. There's also a section in this course, in this website called Autism Recovery 101. This is a 6-module biomedical course specifically designed for parents with special needs individuals, loved ones. It's over 10 hours of lecture material and videos. So you can get more information about Autism Recovery System by going to autismrecoverysystem.com. And I'm always available for private consultations as well through my private practice. The best email to reach us is scmedicalcenter@gmail.com or 951-461-4800. If you posted some questions to this webinar, what will happen is Great Plains will end up sending those to me on email. So I usually don't answer questions here because it gets too long, and so we kind of keep the information, very succinct. You can always reach out to me in other ways too. You can reach me through the autismrecoverysystem.com site, and then through my office or my private practice as well. Okay, so thanks so much for joining me this month for this particular talk. I think hopefully this was helpful for you, and we'll see you again next month for another topic. I want to thank also Great Plains Laboratory for sponsoring these webinars on a monthly basis. I mean, I do one a month, and there's other practitioners that also participate in this as well, and all the staff behind the scenes to make it happen. So we need to give a shout out to them for continuing to support these ongoing educational efforts. So this is Dr. Kurt Woeller for Integrative Medicine Academy and the Great Plains webinar service. Thanks so much. Take care.